murder aboard the Orient Express, where every passenger hides a secret. Welcome to Agent Ash. I am your host, Hallow. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? Your voices bring this journey alive. Let's begin. The Orient Express, in all its polished brass and rich mahogany glory, waited at the platform of Istanbul's Sirkeci station, as though aware of its own prestige. The air was cool and faintly scented with coal smoke, and there was a kind of purposeful bustle about the crowd that made the train seem less a mode of transport and more a moving stage for human drama. Passengers stepped into their compartments with the air of people who knew that, once aboard, they would be in one another's company for days, too long for masks not to slip. Monsieur Hercule Poirot, seated in the corner of the station buffet, sipped his small, perfectly brewed cup of coffee with the utmost serenity. His luggage was already aboard. His seat, an enviable single in a first-class carriage, was assured. He had no intention of rushing. "It is," he murmured to himself, "the crime of travel, this hurry." The crowd on the platform had drawn his eye. There was a tall, dark-haired gentleman with the controlled, almost military posture of someone used to command. Colonel Gerald Fanshawe, if Poirot recalled the name, from the ticket list provided discreetly by the conductor. Near him, a woman of extraordinary poise, her dark green travelling suit perfectly tailored, her gloves pearl grey. She spoke to the colonel in low tones, her eyes darting occasionally toward a younger man standing apart, smoking in a manner that was too studied to be mere habit. Poirot's gaze, so often mistaken for idle curiosity, was in fact a meticulous gathering of impressions. He noted the minute twitch at the corner of the young smoker's mouth when the lady glanced his way, the colonel's faint frown, and the quick way the lady turned her head when she caught sight of a man in a camel-hair coat striding toward the carriage. The camel-hair man was heavy-set, with an air of self-importance that could have filled a compartment on its own. Soon the whistle blew, and the great train stirred to life. Poirot took his seat in the first-class salon, where the linen gleamed and the silverware lay in perfect alignment. The other passengers filtered in, the car a microcosm of society. Colonel Fanshawe, whose eyes missed nothing. Mrs. Celia Markham, the elegant lady in green. Robert Vale, the sullen young smoker. Hector Rawlings, the camel-hair coat, a businessman whose manner suggested his deals left bruises. Madame Lefebvre, a Frenchwoman in her 50s, expensively dressed, but with the restless air of one unused to stillness. And a few others, each carrying their own invisible baggage. Dinner that night was a careful dance of conversation. Poirot, as was his custom, allowed others to speak more than he did. A casual remark about the difficulty of the border crossing into Europe drew a flicker of tension from Mrs. Markham. Colonel Fanshawe steered the talk away, but Poirot noted the quickness of it. Robert Vale barely touched his food, preferring to toy with his wine-glass. Hector Rawlings was loud, dismissive, and Poirot suspected deliberately provocative. It was not until the second night, as the Orient Express curved through the snowy passes of Bulgaria, that the first sign of real trouble appeared. The train was due to stop briefly in Sofia, yet Poirot was roused from his light doze by the low, urgent voices of the conductor and the chef de train in the corridor outside his compartment. By the time he emerged, the air in the carriage had shifted from comfortable luxury to something taut and brittle. Colonel Fanshawe stood in the doorway of compartment 7, his jaw set. Mrs. Markham was pale, clutching the edge of a seat for support. Hector Rawlings was nowhere to be seen, and in the narrow bed of compartment 7 lay Robert Vale, his eyes wide open, his mouth slack. The half-empty wine-glass on the small table beside him gave off the faintest trace of bitter almonds. Poirot's gaze travelled slowly around the compartment, before returning to the body. "Mon Dieu," he said softly, "it appears that this journey will not be so tranquil as I imagined." The conductor's lantern cast an amber oval upon the corridor carpet as Poirot bent delicately to close the dead man's eyes. It was not sentiment, but propriety. There was a slovenliness in death which offended him. He drew the coverlet up to the clean line of the jaw, and then, with a small motion of the fingers that would have passed unnoticed to any but the most observant, he straightened the water-glass on the bedside table until its rim sat parallel with the edge. When he stood, the chef de train, a tall man whose dignity wavered between duty and alarm, looked at him as though he had, by that single adjustment, restored some moral balance to the coach. "We are due in Sofia within the hour, Monsieur Poirot," the man said, lowering his voice. "The station authorities—" "Will be informed, naturellement," Poirot finished, and his eyes softened. "But until then, I beg that no one is permitted to leave his compartment unless asked. Lock the vestibules and post a conductor in each salon. The passengers will be distressed. They must also be contained. It is not that we accuse, you understand, only that we make order." The chef de train nodded quickly and disappeared toward the end of the coach, already issuing instructions with that polished authority peculiar to railway men who have shepherded barons and bankers alike. Poirot, gloved and careful, leaned nearer to the small table. The faint odor that had reached him at once in the doorway spoke clearly now. It was the bitter kernel, the whisper of almonds that was not almond at all, drifting like an indiscretion the air would not keep. The stem of the wine-glass bore no obvious smear, but the liquid was an odd, unapologetic pink, the kind favored by young men who wish to drink without committing themselves either to wine or to sobriety. He regarded it with a little distaste. The cork of the bottle, no longer in the compartment, had likely gone with the glass from the dining car, if it had come from there at all. He stepped back. Colonel Fanshawe still stood rigid in the doorway, the cords at his neck visible. "I did not touch anything," the colonel said. "I found him like this. Only the glass was closer to his hand." "You are precise, Colonel," said Poirot. "It is admirable." His eyes travelled to Mrs. Markham, who was seated just opposite in the corridor, her gloved hands folded tight over one another as if to prevent their shaking. "Madame has had a shock. Someone should fetch for her some hot tea, chamomile if it is available, and, if you please, a slice of lemon thin as paper. It persuades the nerves to behave." "I am quite all right," said Mrs. Markham at once, which was the thing people said when it was not true. "I heard the conductor speak to the colonel, and, well, I thought perhaps I might be of use. Mr. Vale took his dinner rather late. I saw him pass the salon after midnight." "A late dinner," murmured Poirot, "and yet the glass in here suggests not a dinner wine. It is curious. It is as if Monsieur Vale had a taste for neglecting both the stomach and the clock." He glanced down once more, then issued a small, decisive nod. "We shall leave all as it is. At Sofia, the doctor will confirm what we already know, and the police will make their notes. But the truth, I think, will ride on with us, like an uninvited guest who has chosen a long journey to be introduced." There was a little movement at the farther end of the corridor, and Madame Lefebvre appeared, her perfume arriving a heartbeat before she did. She wore a robe de chambre, whose silk muttered discreetly as she walked, and a scarf tied round her head in a manner obdurately chic at such an hour. "What is it?" she demanded softly. "The conductor refused to tell me. I am not a child." Poirot inclined his head. "A misfortune, madame. One of our fellow passengers has been, how shall I say, taken ill." Madame Lefebvre's eyes, appraising and very quick, slipped past him and landed on the bed. For a second they widened, then the lids lowered, too slowly not to be seen by a man who regarded eyelids as he would footprints. "Ah," she said, "he has taken ill unto death. Pardonnez-moi. Does one say that in English? My husband used to say that we are all in the waiting room together. One simply never knows who will be called next." "Your husband was a philosopher," said Poirot. "My husband owned hotels," she returned dryly. "Philosophy was necessary." She turned to Mrs. Markham, whose composure was beginning to fray at the edges. "Come, ma, chère, you will sit with me for a little while. There is no benefit in staring. Death does not answer when one stares." With this unarguable remark, she guided the younger woman gently down the corridor. The colonel remained. He cleared his throat. "If there's anything I can do, Monsieur Poirot—" "There will be much you can do," Poirot replied. "But not now. For the present, if you would be so good as to find the conductor who attends the restaurant car, and ask him from me a very exact account of the last hour of service. Who came late, who changed his mind, who sent back a plate that was cold. These things are the small coins of human behavior, and I am a miser who counts them." The colonel glanced, helplessly grateful for a task, and departed at once. Poirot stood for a moment quite still, listening to the motors, to the cold night pressing at the windows, to the tiny adjustments of wood and steel that a train makes when it moves through snow. A gentleman travelling alone in the next compartment coughed in his sleep, a dry, careful cough that tried not to be heard. Poirot's eyes moved to the corridor opposite. The heavy-set man in the camel-hair coat, Hector Rawlings, was conspicuously absent. He had been conspicuously absent, in fact, since the dessert course, when he had made a remark about the Balkan frontiers that caused the quiet Italian art dealer at the corner table to compress his lips in a way suggestive of inconvenient knowledge. Rawlings' own compartment was 2 doors down, across the narrow passage. Poirot noted its handle. No handkerchief tied there, no sign that its occupant wished not to be disturbed. Yet the keyhole felt watched, as though an eye had lately peered. He shut the door of compartment 7 with a tender finality, and the chef de train reappeared almost at once, with a conductor from the sleeping car and a porter whose youth had not prepared him for the night's curriculum. Poirot spoke to them softly. No luggage was to be moved in or out. No porter was to admit any person to the platform at Sofia, save at the instruction of the police. The dining car's accounts for the evening were to be brought to him forthwith. It was a ceremony of restriction that calmed them, and, by extension, himself. Sofia station arrived as a dimly luminous sequence of lamps swaying through the snow. A local police inspector with a moustache brave for its size boarded with a doctor whose satchel had seen both honest work and theatre. There was the usual exchange of cards and the unusual briefness of examination. The doctor bent, sniffed, made a little moue of distaste that was almost appreciative, and announced what any educated nose would have known. The inspector peered at the wine-glass, as though it might volunteer a confession, then looked at Poirot with a deference that had in it the seed of relief. "You will continue with the train, Monsieur Poirot?" he asked in French. "With your permission," Poirot said. "You will take the formalities, the signatures. You will warn your colleagues further along the line. But the mind that did this," he gestured without looking back, "it has calculated for the hours ahead, not the hour behind. We do not oblige it by stepping off the stage it has chosen." There was a brief, bureaucratic bustle, the taking of names, the stamping of papers, and then the signal waved, and the Orient Express slid back into the winter night, leaving Sofia and its policemen receding like a moral offered and declined. The chef de train, now pale with the burden of his role in a drama the brochures never promised, invited Poirot to use the small salon at the end of the first-class coach. Poirot agreed. A table was set there with a writing pad, a carafe of water, and by the time Poirot sat, a small pot of chocolate, which the chef de train presented with an air of having anticipated genius. Poirot took one sip, allowed one corner of his mouth to approve, and set the cup down precisely at the right-hand corner of the blotter. Passengers began to arrive, not summoned yet, but drawn by the magnet of event. They came in pairs or singly, as temper dictated. Colonel Fanshawe first, having obtained, with military efficiency, a list of the diners and the hour each had taken his meal. He placed it on the table with the stiff deference of a man delivering ammunition. "It's incomplete," he said, "but the maître d'hôtel believes it accurate." Mrs. Celia Markham entered a minute later, her pallor largely conquered, a silk scarf tied low at her throat, as if to protect it from questions. She did not sit, but stood by the far window and watched her reflection in it, as though that other ghostly Mrs. Markham might steady her. Madame Lefebvre arrived with a murmur of fabric, nodded once at Poirot, and chose the chair at the angle that allowed her to see the door, the table, and the tea-tray in a single elegant glance. The Italian art dealer, Signor Luca Bellini, as Poirot had learned, came reluctantly, with the quiet feet of a man used to visiting galleries, not police. Close on his heels was Dr. Leopold Hirsch, a Viennese physician whose tweeds were too good for travel, and whose manner was too practised not to be noticed. He had attended an elderly gentleman in the next coach for a touch of indigestion earlier that evening, and mentioned this with an air that made Poirot think he was filing a preemptive alibi under medical virtue. Others followed, a Swiss governess with a face like a clean ledger, a middle-aged journalist with ink under his nails, and the defensive sarcasm of a man who knew too much about the world to be surprised, and was, nonetheless, very surprised. Hector Rawlings did not come. Poirot let the room arrange itself around its own gravity. He did not call for silence, nor did he demand order. He allowed it to discover itself. It was always instructive to learn who filled a pause and who stepped around it. The journalist, incapable of not narrating, offered a theory about Balkan partisans and foreign agents, which Colonel Fanshawe stopped with a cough that was not a cough. Mrs. Markham asked if there was, if it was possible, if there had been a mistake. Madame Lefebvre touched her sleeve and said, "Non, ma chère," very gently, as though she were easing a needle through fine silk. At length Poirot rose. He did not clear his throat. He simply stood until the expectation in the room rose to meet him. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said, "this is a sorrow. A young man, très jeune, has died on a journey which should have taken him from one life to another. It is a closed world we occupy, wood, brass, and the snow without. So we must be precise, we must be calm, we must be just. There will be questions. I will ask each of you, in turn, for a little time. You will tell me where you were, what you saw, and more important, what you thought. If there is something that is nothing, you will tell me that also. The nothing of one person is sometimes the something of another." He paused. Somewhere, far down the train, a door thudded softly, like a punctuation mark placed by an invisible editor. "But before we begin, I ask two small courtesies. The first, that if any of you has in his possession any item belonging to the deceased, it is brought to me now, here, with no shame, and no explanation asked. The second, that Mr. Hector Rawlings be sent for without delay." A beat passed. Then Signor Bellini produced, from the inside pocket of his jacket, a folded paper. "I found this," he said, almost apologetically, "on the floor of the corridor near compartment 7. It looked private. I did not wish to give it to the staff." Poirot received it with the same care he would have given a wounded bird. He did not yet unfold it. "Merci, signor." His gaze moved past him to the door. The Swiss governess had already risen, efficient as a metronome. "I will ask the conductor for Mr. Rawlings," she said, and departed. The chef de train, returning at that moment with the restaurant ledger, murmured that Mr. Rawlings's compartment had been empty since shortly after dinner. His coat, yes, the camel hair, was gone from its hook. He had not been seen to retire, neither had he requested night service. He could be in the smoking room, the chef de train suggested, not believing it. Or he might have moved to speak with someone. Poirot's eyes rested for a moment on the sheet of paper against his palm. He laid it, still folded, upon the blotter, and placed the carafe upon its corner, not to secure it, but to postpone its temptations. "Then we will discover where Mr. Rawlings has moved to speak," he said mildly. "Meanwhile, we will begin with the facts that breathe. Colonel, if you please, the list. Madame Lefebvre, you will keep Mrs. Markham company and prevent the journalist from writing poetry. Signor Bellini, you and I will speak for 5 minutes. After that, Doctor, Hirsch will allow me the pleasure of his theories about stomachs and clocks." There was, for the first time, the faintest ripple of something like humour. It eased the set of shoulders, loosened 2 mouths from their tightness, and persuaded the room to remember that humanity still existed among brass rails and tragedy. Poirot let the moment expand, then took it back. "In such cases," he said, almost to himself, "one seeks the grand gesture, the quarrel, the threat, the shadow at the curtain, but very often it is the small discourtesy, the impoliteness of a glass set down without thinking, that illuminates the soul. We shall see." The door opened without ceremony. The Swiss governess returned, her neatness slightly disturbed by the haste of her step. Behind her, the conductor looked unhappy. "Mr. Rawlings is not in the smoking room, monsieur," she said, "nor in the lavatory, nor with the card players, and his compartment is still empty. The window in the end vestibule, however, it was unlatched." "Unlatched," murmured Poirot. Snow hissed softly against the glass of the salon as the train curved through the night. "Ah, then we must make our circle smaller, not larger. Sit, mademoiselle. We will not chase the wind. We will sit, and we will listen, and we will think. The one who wishes to run will tell us more by his absence than by his presence." He drew the chair a fraction closer to the table, squared the blotter, and opened his little notebook with the reverence of a priest about to say Mass. Outside, the winter pressed its white face to the window. Inside, the little grey cells began, without fuss, to arrange the first figures on the board. Poirot kept his gaze on the neat page of his notebook, though his attention was spread delicately across the salon, like a fine net in still water. The absence of Hector Rawlings had already altered the rhythm of the gathering. Without him, there was a certain void, an unoccupied space in the conversation where someone's natural loudness ought to be, and the others were aware of it. Absence, Poirot reflected, was sometimes more revealing than presence. Signor Bellini sat opposite, his long fingers resting on his knees, the crease in his trousers as precise as if it had been ironed that morning. His dark eyes, however, were not calm. They flickered towards the folded sheet of paper under the carafe, then away, and then back again. Poirot allowed him a moment to consider whether or not to speak, unprompted. The Italian did not. "You found the paper in the corridor?" Poirot began, his tone no sharper than the edge of a teacup. "Yes," Bellini said at once. "Near compartment 7, folded, but not tightly. I saw writing on it, though I did not read. It looked as if it might have been dropped in haste. I thought it best to give it to you." "And yet," Poirot murmured, "you kept it with you until now. Why?" Bellini shifted in his seat. "I was not sure to whom it belonged. The staff here, they are, how to say, very quick to gossip. I did not wish to add to the noise." Poirot inclined his head slightly. "Consideration is admirable, signor, but also dangerous. One protects a thing, and in so doing, one may protect the wrong person." His gaze drifted briefly towards Mrs. Markham at the far side of the salon. "You dined in the second seating, yes?" Bellini nodded. "Near the end. I had Business to discuss with Mr. Vale earlier in the evening. This, at last, caused a stir. Madame Lefebvre's brows lifted a fraction. Colonel Fanshawe straightened. Poirot noticed both reactions but let them pass unremarked. "Business?" he asked, his voice still mild. "Art," Bellini said. He had asked me to find a buyer for a small painting, an impressionist work, unsigned but of quality. I had a client in Vienna who might have been interested. We spoke of this, but he became distracted. He asked me to meet him again in Paris. Now, Bellini spread his hands helplessly. Poirot leaned back. Distracted? By what? Bellini hesitated. "A letter," he said at last. "Someone passed him a letter in the dining car, just as the soup was served. He read it, put it in his jacket pocket, and from that moment he barely touched his food. I asked him about it. He laughed, said it was nothing, but he did not finish his wine, which for him was unusual, and he left before dessert." Poirot's eyes moved almost lazily to the folded sheet under the carafe. "And you think this is that letter?" "I do not know," Bellini said, though the tremor in his voice suggested he suspected it very much. Poirot let the silence breathe, filling it with the faint hiss of the train over the rails. Then, with the same deliberate care he had used in arranging the water glass in Vale's compartment, he lifted the carafe and unfolded the paper. The eyes around the room followed every movement, though no one leaned forward. There was a collective restraint, as though they feared that moving closer would make the words more dangerous. It was a single sheet, torn at one edge. The handwriting was neat, feminine, with an economy that avoided flourishes. It read, "You have until Belgrade. After that, it will be too late." There was no signature. Poirot studied the line for a long moment, then refolded the paper and returned it beneath the carafe. "Short, but it has a very long shadow, n'est-ce pas?" Mrs. Markham's fingers tightened around her scarf. Colonel Fanshaw's jaw moved as though he were grinding his teeth, but no sound came. Madame Lefebvre was entirely still, though her eyes were bright with something that was not surprise. Dr. Hirsch leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "If the note was written before we left Istanbul, then the writer must be on the train," he said. "Otherwise, how could it have been given to him in the dining car?" Poirot gave him a small smile. "It is indeed likely, Doctor, but possible also that it was handed to a member of the staff with instructions to deliver it. One must be careful before one narrows the circle too tightly." The door opened, and the Swiss governess returned. She shook her head once, no news of Rawlings, and took her seat with that prim efficiency that made even her silences seem deliberate. Poirot closed his notebook and rose. "Now, mes amis, I will ask to speak to each of you in your compartments, privately. We will begin with Madame Lefebvre." She accepted this with a small nod, and rose, the perfume of her departure lingering like a carefully chosen word. Poirot escorted her to her compartment, his pace unhurried, allowing the train's motion to frame their walk as if it were a corridor in a gallery. Inside, the lamplight made her silk dressing gown gleam. She did not sit until he gestured to a chair, and even then her posture suggested she was prepared to stand again at a moment's notice. "You knew Monsieur Vale?" Poirot began. "Well enough to nod to in the corridor," she said. "We spoke, perhaps twice. He was young, and I am not." Poirot allowed himself a faint smile. "Age is a number. Interest is a motive. You saw him yesterday evening?" "In the salon, yes. He was restless. He asked me about the next stop after Sofia. Belgrade, of course. I told him it was several hours yet. He looked troubled. Not frightened, not exactly, but he had the air of someone waiting for a letter that had already arrived." Poirot's gaze sharpened slightly. "Did you see anyone pass him such a letter?" "Number. But I saw Mrs. Markham leave the dining car just before he did. She was flushed, as if she had been speaking too quickly." When Poirot returned to the salon, Mrs. Markham's turn came next. She rose with the reluctance of someone about to answer a question she has been dreading. Her compartment was immaculate, though her hands could not remain still. "You left the dining car just before Monsieur Val?" Poirot said. "Yes, I wasn't hungry. The air was close. I went to fetch a book from my compartment." "And you spoke to him?" "Numberwell? Yes, briefly. I asked if he was feeling quite well. He looked pale. He said he was fine, just tired. Then he walked on." Poirot regarded her evenly. "Did you know him before this journey?" Her eyes dropped. "I met him once before, in London, at a reception. We had a mutual acquaintance, Hector Rawlings." Poirot did not move, but his mind placed the names side by side, weighing their proximity. "And now Rawlings is missing." "I can't explain that," she said quickly, too quickly. "I hardly knew him." Poirot inclined his head, as though noting a piece on the board he would not yet move. One by one the others were seen. Colonel Fanshawe, who admitted to overhearing part of Vale and Bellini's conversation. Dr. Hirsch, who had seen Rawlings leave the dining car and head toward the luggage car. The journalist, who claimed to have noticed nothing, but was oddly precise about the time Vale returned to his compartment. By the time Poirot returned to the salon, the folded note was still beneath the carafe, and the room seemed to hold its breath. The chef de train entered then, his voice low but urgent. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, "the night porter has just remembered something. When the train stopped briefly outside Sofia, before the station, he saw a man in a camel hair coat standing between the cars. Not smoking, just standing, looking at the snow. When he passed again a few minutes later, the man was gone." Poirot's eyes rested on the folded paper. "Then, my friend, we must ask ourselves, did he leave the train, or did he wish us to believe he had? And if he wished that, what did he wish to hide?" The snow outside pressed against the windows like a silent witness, and in the dim light of the salon, Poirot's little grey cells began to circle, narrowing, always narrowing, towards the thing that would not yet name itself. Poirot sat very still, his fingertips pressed together, his gaze fixed not on the paper beneath the carafe, but on the place just above it, as if the note's significance might be clearer when viewed indirectly. The salon had thinned. Several passengers had retreated to their compartments, but a low hum of unease still hung in the air, the sort that made every footstep in the corridor sound louder than it was. Madame Lefebvre had excused herself with a remark about too much tragedy for one evening, while the colonel remained at his post, the instinct to guard making him reluctant to leave the heart of the matter. The chef de train lingered by the door, uncertain whether to speak further. Poirot looked up at him and said softly, "The man in the camel hair coat? When the porter saw him between the cars, there was no station in sight?" "None, monsieur. We were moving slowly through the snow. Some delay ahead on the line, perhaps." "Ah," Poirot murmured. "So it was an interlude. And a man chooses to stand between the cars in bitter cold when he might stand in the warmth. That is never by accident." The chef de train hesitated, then lowered his voice further. The porter thought the man was waiting for something, but he carried nothing. No cigarette, no drink, just stood there. Poirot gave a slight nod, as if placing the image into its proper place in the mental tableau he was arranging. "Merci. That will be all for now. But you will instruct the staff. Should anyone, attempt to enter the luggage car without permission, you will inform me at once." When the man had gone, Poirot allowed his eyes to drift to Colonel Fanshawe. "You have been a soldier, mon colonel. Tell me, on a moving train, where might a man conceal himself so that casual inspection would not find him?" The colonel considered. "In the luggage car, certainly. Depending on the load, there are corners and trunks that could hide a man. The service compartments, perhaps. And, he hesitated, between the cars, if he were reckless enough. Reckless or desperate, Poirot said. And if such a man wished to give the impression of having left the train, but did not wish actually to leave it? The Colonel's eyes narrowed. Then he might unfasten a vestibule window, leave it ajar just enough for someone to think he'd gone through it, and then slip away to a hiding place until the search had passed. Just so, said Poirot, an absence that is an illusion, and illusions, mon colonel, are the currency of murder. The sound of the wheels over the rails deepened as the train began to climb through another pass. Poirot rose without haste and returned to his compartment for a moment, collecting his overcoat and gloves. When he returned to the salon, he addressed the Colonel. "We will look at the luggage car, but we will do so without announcing our intention. If our missing friend is there, we shall find either him or the trace of him." The two men moved down the corridor, their pace measured, the sway of the train obliging them to match steps. At the far end, Poirot found the conductor, who held the key to the luggage car and requested it with such calm certainty that the man handed it over without question. Inside, the air was colder, smelling faintly of waxed canvas and travel dust. Wooden crates, trunks, and leather valises were stacked in orderly tiers, secured by straps. Poirot's eyes roved over the scene, missing nothing. The small indentation in a layer of dust on the lid of a crate, the faint scuff mark on floor where a boot had pressed recently, the strap, whose buckle was refastened one notch tighter than the others. "There," Poirot said softly, indicating the crate with the dust mark. The Colonel stepped forward, unfastened the strap, and lifted the lid. Inside were bundles of cloth, costumes by the look of them, wrapped in brown paper. They were undisturbed. "Not this one," Poirot said, "but here." He moved to a corner where two large trunks stood side by side. One had a fine coat of frost on the clasp, the other did not. A clasp will frost when it is left shut in the cold, but this one has been opened recently, see? The metal is bare, no frost. The Colonel crouched and opened it. Inside were blankets, railway issue, folded neatly but with one corner still warm to the touch. The warmth was faint, but unmistakable. "He has been here," Poirot said, "not long ago. And if he is not here now, it is because he has moved on to some other concealment." They replaced everything exactly as they had found it. As they stepped back into the corridor, Poirot's eyes met the chef de train's. "You will have someone discreetly watch this car. If Rawlings returns, I wish to know before he draws." Breath. Returning to the salon, Poirot found that Mrs. Markham had gone, but Madame Lefebvre had reappeared, her colour high and her manner faintly irritated, as if she had been disturbed in something private. Dr. Hirsch stood at the window, his back to the room, while Signor Bellini sat with a cup of coffee untouched before him. Poirot resumed his seat. "It is strange, is it not," he said conversationally, "how a man may vanish in so small a world as a train. One thinks it impossible, and yet—" He let the sentence trail away deliberately. Dr. Hirsch turned. "Do you believe Rawlings killed Vale?" Poirot's expression was serene. "I believe, Doctor, that Rawlings is hiding. That is not the same thing. And if he is hiding, it is because he fears something, perhaps being accused, perhaps something else entirely. Until we find him, we cannot know which." Madame Lefebvre gave a delicate shrug. "It seems to me that the obvious answer is usually the correct one. A quarrel, a letter, a sudden death. What else do we require?" "Madame," Poirot said gently, "the obvious answer is often a mask, and it is the nature of masks to be worn for the benefit of the audience. But I prefer to know what the actor looks like when the mask is removed." The door to the salon opened then, and the journalist entered, a folded newspaper in his hand. "From the guard at Sofia," he said, He let me have it. Interesting, don't you think? He laid it on the table. The headline, in bold Cyrillic letters, spoke of a financial scandal in London. Beneath it, a grainy photograph of Hector Rawlings appeared, his face caught mid-expression, as if about to deny something. "Ah," Poirot said softly, "our missing man becomes more interesting, and perhaps our dead man also, if they were connected." He tapped the photograph with one fingertip. "You see, mes amis, murder is rarely a single thread. It is a weaving, and each thread touches another." He closed the newspaper and set it aside. "We will find Rawlings, and when we do, we will also find the reason why Monsieur Vale's life could be measured in hours after leaving Istanbul." The train swayed into a long, dark tunnel, the lights flickering once. When they steadied, Poirot's gaze was already fixed on the door, as though expecting it to open. And when it did, it was not Rawlings who entered, but the Swiss governess, her face pale, her composure strained. "There is something you should see, Monsieur Poirot," she said quietly. "In the ladies' washroom, a piece of cloth, torn with stains, caught in the hinge of the window." Poirot rose at once, his movements precise, but unhurried. "Then we go, mademoiselle, for in such little things the truth sometimes leaves its fingerprints." The others watched as he followed her out. The folded note remained under the carafe, its words unchanged, yet in the air of the salon there was now the feeling that the walls of the puzzle were drawing in. And somewhere, in the narrow passages of the train, Hector Rawlings was either watching or running, but in either case, the little grey cells of Hercule Poirot were already shortening the distance between them. The governess led the way down the narrow corridor, her sensible shoes making almost no sound on the carpet, yet the urgency in her stride betrayed a suppressed agitation. Poirot followed, his eyes not on her back, but on the small details the passing compartments offered. Curtains drawn too tightly, doors left a fraction open as if to eavesdrop, the faint draught where a window was not perfectly closed. The rhythm of the train, that steady iron heartbeat, seemed to slow in his mind, each beat allowing him to arrange what he already knew against what he was about to see. In the ladies' washroom, the scent of soap and the faint metallic tang of the plumbing mingled with something sharper, cold air, faint but insistent. The governess gestured toward the far window. It was small, high enough that one would need to stand on the marble step to reach it, but the latch was not fully secure. Caught in the metal hinge, fluttering slightly in the draught, was a scrap of cloth. Poirot stepped closer, producing from his pocket a pair of fine tweezers, the kind one might use for adjusting a moustache or retrieving evidence without touching it. The fragment came free with the smallest tug. It was torn from a heavier garment, camel-coloured, the weave coarse and robust. Along one edge, dark stains had dried in irregular patterns. Poirot brought it closer to his nose. The scent was unmistakable to a man whose nose had catalogued more poisons and their disguises than most apothecaries. Wine, certainly, but laced with something bitter beneath. "Camel hair coat," Poirot said softly, more to himself than to the governess. "And not from the hem or the cuff. No, this is torn from near a seam, perhaps caught in haste. It has brushed against the poisoned wine-glass or the bottle." His eyes sharpened, and he looked to the latch. It was opened from within, but only just. A man could not have climbed out here, but he could throw something. The governess's brow furrowed. "Throw what, monsieur?" "That, mademoiselle, is the question. Perhaps a small bottle. Perhaps the cork from the wine. Something incriminating, small enough to be lost in the snow by the track." He replaced the cloth into an envelope and sealed it with a precise fold. "You have done well to call me." As they returned to the salon, Poirot's mind was already testing possibilities. If Rawlings had torn his coat here, what had he been doing? Disposing of evidence? Meeting someone through the window? The note's threat, "You have until Belgrade," now seemed to hover over every act, a shadow falling forward into time. When they arrived, the atmosphere had shifted again. Madame Lefebvre was gone, Colonel Fanshawe sat with his arms folded, and Dr. Hirsch was engaged in quiet conversation with Signor Bellini. They both fell silent as Poirot entered. He took his seat without announcement, laying the envelope on the table. "We are making progress, mes amis," he said. "Our missing man has left us a fragment of his coat, and perhaps also a part of his plan. But still, there are pieces missing. To find them, we must look not only for what is hidden, but for what has been shown to us too clearly." Mrs. Markham reappeared then, her hair slightly disordered, as if she had been lying down. She paused at the sight of the envelope. "You've found something?" Poirot inclined his head. "Something small, madame, but it may yet prove to be the thread that unravels the whole tapestry. Tell me, at dinner, where was Mr. Rawlings seated in relation to Mr. Vale?" Her eyes shifted slightly to the side, as if she were replaying the scene. "Across the aisle, one table down. They did not speak. And yet," Poirot said gently, "it would have been possible for one to approach the other without attracting much notice." She hesitated. "Yes, but—" Poirot lifted a hand, silencing her without discourtesy. "No conclusions yet, madame. Only possibilities." The chef de train entered, his face tight. "Monsieur Poirot, the station-master at Nice will have gendarmes ready when we arrive in 2 hours. Do you wish to disembark the passengers for questioning?" Poirot shook his head at once. "Non. That will scatter the flock, and I prefer my suspects contained. We will speak to the police, yes, but the game will be played here. A killer who feels the net closing too quickly may do something regrettable." He rose again, his restlessness now deliberate. "Colonel, walk with me. We will visit Mr. Vale's compartment once more. There are small details that I wish to see again." The colonel followed without comment. In compartment 7, the body had been removed at Sophia, but the arrangement of the room was otherwise untouched. Poirot's eyes went to the wine-glass still on the table, now dulled under the light. He bent to examine the carpet beneath the table. There, pressed into the pile, was a tiny irregular mark, half-moon in shape. He touched it lightly with his gloved fingertip. "A heel," Poirot murmured. "Not Vale's. His shoes were soft-soled slippers when found. Someone else stood here, someone in a hurry, leaning over the table." He straightened. "And the grain of the carpet is disturbed toward the door, as if the person left quickly." The colonel studied the mark. "Could have been made earlier." "Could have been," Poirot agreed, "but it was not brushed away by the steward's steps. Therefore it is recent. We are building a picture, mon colonel, piece by piece." They stepped back into the corridor, just as the Swiss governess approached again, her usual composure unsettled. "Monsieur Poirot, there is a message for you, slipped under your compartment door." She handed him a folded slip of paper, unaddressed, but written in the same hand as the earlier note. Poirot opened it slowly, the faintest arch of his brow betraying interest. "You look in the wrong place. It is not Rawlings you should fear." Poirot read it twice, then passed it to the colonel without comment. "So," he said softly, "our killer has a sense of theatre. They wish to direct my attention. But to do so, they must know my attention, and that means they watch me closely. Always a risk, mon colonel, for in watching, one is also seen." The colonel's mouth tightened. Could it be genuine, that Rawlings is innocent? Poirot smiled faintly. "Innocent of this crime, perhaps. Innocent in life? That is another matter. But I do not discard Rawlings yet. I only adjust the balance in my mind." They returned to the salon, where Poirot placed the new note beside the old one, studying them as if the words themselves might shift under his gaze. "2 notes," he said aloud. Both anonymous, both from the same hand. The first to Vale, with a deadline. The second to me, with a warning. One written before death, one after. The writer is still among us. His eyes moved from face to face, pausing on each passenger in turn. None met his gaze for long, though Madame Lefebvre managed the longest, before looking away with a faint, ironic smile. Poirot leaned back. We will proceed, mes amis, as we began, with patience. The truth will not run away from us, but perhaps, and here his eyes gleamed with a trace of mischief, someone else will. Outside the night pressed close, and the rails sang their cold song. Inside, the walls of the case tightened, drawing all of them toward Belgrade, and the moment when, Poirot knew, the mask would have to come off. Poirot let the silence hang, not a pause born of uncertainty, but the measured quiet of a man who knew that every second without speech coaxed something loose from those determined to hold it. The chef de train, hovering in the doorway, shifted his weight from one polished shoe to the other, as if uncertain whether he was permitted to breathe. Madame Lefebvre traced an idle circle on the armrest with one gloved fingertip, while Mrs. Markham avoided everyone's eyes, staring instead at the silver teapot on the low table, as though it might save her from the atmosphere tightening around them. The train swayed through a curve, the rhythm of the wheels changing for a moment before resuming their steady cadence. Poirot drew the two anonymous notes closer, aligning their edges precisely, his eyes moving from one to the other. The slant of the writing, the pressure of the pen, both identical. The earlier note to Vale had been a sentence delivered like a blade. The second, to him, was something else entirely, part warning, part manipulation. That, he thought, was the more dangerous of the two. It was one thing to threaten a man marked for death, quite another to play games with the hunter. You will wish to question us again? Colonel Fanshaw's voice was carefully neutral, though beneath it lay the faintest challenge. Poirot looked up. In time, yes, but there are certain things I must see before we speak further. For example, what Mr. Vale had with him when he boarded this train in Istanbul. The chef de train cleared his throat. His luggage is in the storage compartment adjacent to his sleeping berth. It has not been touched. Poirot rose, smoothing an invisible crease in his cuff. Then, if you please, we will inspect it now, and I ask that everyone remain here until I return. The temptation to wander in such moments is great, but it is in the stillness that truth sometimes walks in uninvited. With the colonel at his side and the chef de train leading, Poirot moved down the corridor to the narrow storage space. The luggage was neatly stacked, a single large leather case, a smaller valise, and a hat box. The locks yielded easily to the conductor's key. The leather case held clothing of good quality, but nothing extravagant. 2 suits, shirts, a pair of polished shoes, each garment folded with care that suggested either Vale himself was meticulous or someone had packed for him. A folded overcoat lay at the bottom, its pockets empty. The smaller valise contained toiletries, a slim novel in French, and, curiously, an empty leather folder with straps designed to hold papers or documents. It was clean, as if whatever it had carried had been removed recently. Poirot ran a finger along the inner seam of the valise. A faint line of discoloration, paper dust perhaps, marked where something had sat snugly for some time. Something was here, he murmured, and now it is gone. The hat box was unremarkable, save for a single envelope tucked beneath the lining. Poirot retrieved it delicately. Inside was a calling card, creamstock, thick, with the name Hector Rawlings in a bold, confident type. Beneath it, in ink, were the words, Belgrade, Hotel Adriatic, Tuesday. He held it up to the light. Our absent friend had an appointment with the deceased, and the meeting was not to be in Istanbul or Paris, but here, midway, Belgrade. a city where one can make arrangements quietly, away from the watchful eyes of home. The colonel frowned. What kind of arrangements? Poirot replaced the card in its envelope. The kind that requires no record until one party decides he would prefer a different outcome. And then, perhaps, there is a letter with a deadline. Returning to the salon, Poirot set the envelope on the table beside the notes. No one spoke. All eyes were on him. Monsieur Rawlings and Monsieur Vale had business together. The nature of it we will discover. But we know now that Belgrade was the hinge upon which their affair was to turn. Monsieur Vale received a warning that it would be too late after that city, and now Monsieur Rawlings has vanished before we could reach it. Mrs. Markham stirred in her seat. You think Hector killed him to protect himself? Poirot's glance was gentle, almost indulgent. I think, madame, that killing to protect oneself is a crude method, and Monsieur Rawlings does not strike me as a man who works crudely. If he killed, it was for gain. If he hides, it is for fear. But we must consider also this possibility, that someone wishes us to think he is the killer. Bellini leaned forward slightly. You mean framing him? Poirot allowed himself a small smile. Precisely. But to frame a man, one must know his habits, his coat, his movements, and one must be confident that, when he disappears, suspicion will follow him like a faithful dog. That confidence suggests familiarity. His eyes shifted subtly to Madame Lefebvre, who met his gaze without flinching, then to Mrs. Markham, whose lashes lowered too quickly. The train jolted slightly, a signal that the line ahead had cleared, and the tempo of the wheels quickened. Outside, the night pressed close, the glass reflecting the salon's occupants back at themselves. Poirot's voice cut through the hum. Before Nice, I will require one further thing, the passenger manifest from Istanbul to Sofia. It will show me if there was anyone who joined us late or left early. In such a closed world, the arrival or disappearance of even one person changes the balance entirely. The chef de train promised to bring it at once. Poirot resumed his seat, hands resting lightly on his knees. And in the meantime, mes amis, I suggest you reflect. There is still time to bring me what you have withheld before I come to take it from you. No one moved. The only sound was the muted song of the rails, and yet the air in the salon felt as taut as a violin string. Poirot knew this was the moment when the guilty began to feel the net, not in its closing, but in its presence, an invisible constraint drawing closer with each turn of the wheels. In his mind, the picture had grown clearer. The torn scrap of camel hair, the poisoned wine, the missing documents from Vale's case, the meeting set for Belgrade, and now the second note aimed directly at him. The murderer was not improvising. They had begun this journey with a design in mind, and Poirot was determined to see the pattern before the train reached its next station. The chef de train returned with the manifest, and Poirot's eyes flicked down the list with brisk precision. His gaze paused midway, one brow lifting a fraction before he masked the reaction. He folded the paper, slid it into his pocket, and stood. Now, mes amis, I will take a short walk. It is good for the digestion, and for the little grey cells. As he stepped into the corridor, Poirot's reflection in the window was overlaid with the dark sweep of the landscape outside. Somewhere ahead lay Nice, and beyond it, Belgrade. But before the train reached either, he meant to find Hector Rawlings, or prove that someone else had been wearing his guilt like a borrowed coat. The corridor was dim, the lamps along the ceiling swaying slightly as the train curved through the hills. Poirot moved with the ease of a man who knew every step had purpose, his gloved fingers brushing lightly against the polished wood panelling. Each compartment he passed hummed faintly, with the low voices of its occupants, the occasional clink of glassware, or the rustle of turning pages. But it was not the sound of life that held his attention. It was the moments when there was no sound at all, as though someone within held their breath while he walked by. Halfway down the carriage, a door opened abruptly, and Dr. Hirsch stepped out, adjusting his cufflinks with a composure that was just slightly too deliberate. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot. Out for a stroll?" Poirot inclined his head. "As are you, perhaps?" The doctor's mouth curved into the kind of smile that was more for himself than for anyone else. "I was checking on a patient in second class. The elderly gentleman with the stomach complaint earlier. He's sleeping now." "And in good health otherwise?" Poirot asked, his voice mild. "As good as one can expect on this journey," Hirsch replied. Then, as if conscious of his own words, added quickly, "The cold is not kind to old bones." Poirot's eyes rested on him for a moment longer than politeness required. "Indeed, doctor, and yet the cold sometimes preserves certain things one wishes might disappear." Hirsch gave a short laugh, but it did not reach his eyes. He excused himself with a nod and moved toward the dining car. Poirot watched him go, noting the faintest trace of a scent, something medicinal, sharp, before continuing his walk. At the end of the carriage, he stepped into the vestibule. The latch on the connecting door to the next car was secure, but the floor here bore a faint crust of snow in one corner. He bent slightly, touching it with a fingertip. The crystals were fresh, not yet melted by the warmth of the train. Someone had been through here recently, perhaps from one of the cars beyond, and had not troubled to close the door quickly enough. He straightened and crossed into the adjoining coach, where the light was a fraction dimmer and the air cooler. The luggage car lay further on, but before he reached it, a faint metallic rattle stopped him. It came from a narrow service compartment, one used for storing cleaning supplies and spare linens. The door was ajar. Poirot eased it open. Inside, the scent of polish and starch was heavy, but beneath it lingered something less domestic, the stale tang of a man who had been in close quarters for too long. A blanket lay in the corner, rumpled in a way that suggested recent use, and on the floor near it, a small glass vial rolled against the edge of a bucket as the train swayed. Poirot stooped to pick it up. The label was torn away, but the residue inside clung in faintly. Yellow streaks. He held it to his nose, catching again that bitter almond trace. The sound of movement in the corridor behind him drew his head up. The Swiss governess stood there, her hands clasped tightly before her. "Is that—" Poirot stepped past her, closing the compartment door with quiet finality. "It is something that has travelled far enough. You are out late, mademoiselle." "I was looking for the steward," she said, her voice low. "Mrs. Markham is unwell. She asked for tea." "Then by all means fetch it," Poirot said. But his eyes remained on her for a beat longer, and when she moved away, her back seemed a fraction stiffer than before. Returning to the salon, Poirot found the manifest still on the table where he had left it earlier. Madame Lefebvre was leafing idly through a magazine. The colonel stood at the window with his arms folded, and Bellini was deep in thought, his coffee still untouched. Mrs. Markham was absent. Poirot placed the vial on the table, the tiny object suddenly commanding all attention. "This," he said, "was found in a service compartment between the passenger cars. Its contents, though nearly gone, are enough to suggest they once had a purpose. A purpose most unpleasant." Bellini's eyes flicked to the colonel, then back to Poirot. "You think it was used on Vale?" "I think," Poirot said slowly, "that the one who used it has been close to us the entire journey, moving when we are distracted, listening when we speak too freely. The vial is small enough to be thrown from a window, but instead it was hidden because the owner meant to keep it until the right moment to dispose of it permanently." Madame Lefebvre closed her magazine with a soft snap. "And now that you have it, monsieur?" "Now," Poirot said, "the owner must wonder what else I may have found. and whether I know to whom it belongs." He let the words settle in the room, his gaze resting briefly on each face in turn. The chef de train appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath. "Monsieur Poirot, the night porter believes he saw Rawlings just now, near the rear of the train." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Near the luggage car?" "Yes, monsieur. But when the porter went to check, there was no one." Poirot rose. "Then we go at once. Colonel, if you will accompany me." The corridor seemed narrower now, the air heavier, as they made their way toward the rear. The luggage car was locked, as before, and undisturbed. But when Poirot opened the vestibule door to the final car, the cold rushed in like a gasp. Snow clung to the steps leading down to the track, and a single boot print marred the whiteness, half melted by warmth, its edge blurred by the motion of the train. Poirot crouched, studying it. One foot on the step, then withdrawn, testing the idea of leaving, perhaps, or looking for something below. His eyes lifted to the darkness beyond the rails. A dangerous game to stand so near the edge at this speed. They returned to the salon without finding Rawlings. The passengers looked up as they entered, the sense of expectancy now almost palpable. Poirot did not speak at once. He sat, adjusted the angle of the carafe over the two notes, and folded his hands. "Mes amis," he said at last, "we approach Nice. There, the gendarmes will come aboard, as agreed. But before they do, I will speak to each of you again, briefly and alone. For it is clear to me now that the murderer has made two mistakes. One was in believing the disguise of circumstance would hold. The other," his eyes lingered on the torn scrap of camel hair in its envelope, on the vial, and finally on the notes, "was in thinking I would not see the hand that moves all these pieces." The train plunged into another tunnel, the sound swelling until the walls seemed to vibrate with it. When it emerged again into the moonlit snow, Poirot's voice was calm, almost conversational. "And when we reach Belgrade, mes amis, there will be no more shadows to hide in." The train's approach to Nice was heralded not by the slowing of the wheels, but by a change in the air among the passengers. Even those who tried to hide it, Colonel Fanshawe with his military stoicism, Madame Lefebvre with her feline poise, could not entirely conceal the restlessness. The station ahead meant intrusion, police uniforms, questions, the possibility of being taken from the warm compartments into the night. For the guilty, it also meant that time was running out. Poirot, seated at the small writing table in the salon, watched each face for the signs that betray when a mind is calculating escape. The chef de train entered quietly to inform him that the gendarmes would board discreetly, as requested, and that the station master had cleared a private waiting room should Poirot wish to use it. Poirot shook his head. "No, my friend, the stage is here, and the actors are all in their places. We will not change the theatre now." When the train eased into the station, the hiss of steam and the crunch of boots on snow filled the night outside. Poirot remained where he was, arranging the torn scrap of camel hair, the two notes, the small glass vial, and the calling card in a careful line on the table. They were not for display so much as for his own mind, a row of small anchors keeping the truth from drifting away in the fog of speculation. Two gendarmes entered with minimal ceremony. Poirot greeted them politely, then asked that they remain at the far end of the carriage until called. "You will see," he murmured to them, "that a criminal trapped among acquaintances often condemns himself more readily than when faced by a stranger in uniform." The first to enter for questioning was the Swiss governess. She sat very straight, her gloved hands folded in her lap. Poirot, without preamble, placed the torn scrap of camel hair before her. "Do you recognize this, mademoiselle?" Her gaze flicked to it, then back to him. "It looks like part of a coat." "It is part of a coat," Poirot agreed softly. Monsieur Rawlings's coat, found in the hinge of a washroom window, a window from which something could have been thrown, something small, like a vial, or perhaps a cork. She did not look at the vial on the table, though he saw the faintest tightening around her eyes. I did not see him there. But you saw someone, Poirot said, leaning forward, on this train, in the last day, who stood where he had no reason to be. Her lips pressed together. For a moment, he thought she would deny it outright, but then she said, "The journalist, last night, near the service compartment." Poirot made a note, then dismissed her. The journalist came next, protesting before the door had even shut behind him. "This is absurd. I was looking for the steward." "In the service compartment?" Poirot asked mildly. "I didn't know it was the service compartment until I opened it. It was empty." "Not empty," Poirot corrected. "A blanket had been used, and a vial was left on the floor. A vial, monsieur, whose contents could kill a man in minutes." The journalist's face went pale, but whether from guilt or the sudden realization of the gravity of the matter, Poirot could not yet tell. He sent him out and called in Madame Lefebvre. She entered as though arriving at a dinner to which she had been reluctantly invited. "Must we do this one by one? It is tedious." "Tedious, perhaps," Poirot said, "but useful. Tell me, madame, how well did you know Monsieur Rawlings?" Her brows lifted. "We met once in Monte Carlo. He was a man who liked to be seen. I was not inclined to provide him the pleasure." "Why?" "Because his calling card was found in Monsieur Vale's luggage," Poirot said, "and the appointment it bore was for Belgrade." Her eyes did not waver. "Then he had business with the young man. What has that to do with me?" "That," Poirot said, "is what I am still considering." He allowed her to go, though he did not believe her composure entirely unshaken. Colonel Fanshawe followed, his answers brisk and economical. He admitted to disliking Rawlings, the kind of man who makes trouble for others without ever seeming to suffer it himself, but denied any knowledge of the notes or the vial. He was dismissed with a slight nod. Bellini was more forthcoming. "I did not trust him," he said of Rawlings, "and Vale, he was too eager, too willing to believe in quick profits. I told him to be careful. He laughed." "And yet," Poirot said, "you arranged to meet him again in Paris." Bellini spread his hands. "Business is business." When all had been spoken to, Poirot sat alone for a moment, the sounds of the station filtering in through the closed door. In his mind, the threads were crossing in ways that no longer seemed accidental. The torn coat, the vial, the missing documents, the meeting in Belgrade, and above it all, the two notes, one to the victim, one to himself. The same hand, the same confidence, a hand that had moved freely among the compartments, comfortable enough to plant suspicion where it was needed. The train jolted as it began to move again, Nice slipping away into the dark. Poirot rose and walked the length of the carriage, his eyes flicking into each compartment. Mrs. Markham was alone, staring at the snowy reflection in her window. The governess sat with her sewing, the needle moving with mechanical precision. Bellini and the colonel were engaged in low conversation, while Madame Lefebvre had withdrawn entirely from view. As he turned back toward the salon, a shadow shifted at the far end of the corridor. Poirot quickened his step, but by the time he reached the vestibule, it was empty, save for a faint scent of cold air and something sharper, acrid, fading into the night. He stood there for a moment, listening to the rails and the steady breathing of the train, before returning to his seat. The chef de train approached, lowering his voice. "Monsieur, the gendarmes found no trace of Rawlings at the station. If he left, he did so without passing them." Poirot's moustache twitched in the ghost of a smile. "Then he has not left. And when a man cannot leave, he must eventually be found." He looked once more at the small line of objects on the table. The time for quiet observation was nearly over. The little grey cells had formed their picture. What remained was to bring the actors together and let the play reach its conclusion. And when that moment came, Poirot knew the truth would have nowhere left to hide. The train had scarcely cleared the outskirts of Nice when Poirot rang for the chef de train and, in a voice pitched for ordinary matters, asked that a notice be passed quietly to each carriage. The police at Belgrade would perform a full search of compartments and luggage upon arrival. It was half truth and half invitation. He watched the words move invisibly along the corridor, into doors, into ears, and judged their effect by the ripples they made rather than any surface show. It was not long before the ripples returned. Colonel Fanshawe came first, as Poirot had expected, a man who preferred to step into weather rather than be caught by it. "You mean to let the authorities turn everyone's bags inside out?" "If necessary," Poirot replied placidly. "You object?" The colonel considered. "Number. But if you want to see a man panic, tell him his luggage will be opened." He hesitated, then added, "Bellini took a walk the moment the steward finished whispering." Mrs. Markham asked for more tea, and then failed to drink it. Madame Lefebvre shut her door with a decisiveness that would have done for a pistol shot. "Et voilà," murmured Poirot. "The sea is stirred. Now we watch for what floats up." When the colonel had gone, Poirot sat for several minutes without moving, his gaze resting on the small array of objects he had kept, like anchors at the salon table. The two notes, one like a knife, one like a flick of the wrist, the torn camel hair, the little vial with its yellow ghosts, Rawlings's card. He let them arrange themselves again in the mind, not in sequence, but in sympathy. Who would write so assuredly to the victim, and later to him? Who had the freedom to move in and out, to be seen and not seen, to carry poison and to speak with the easy authority of the harmless? The answer shimmered at the edges of thought, not yet ready to step into the light. He rose and walked the corridor once more. He did not hurry. He paused at windows to straighten blinds, at a crooked picture to set it to rights, at the little brass ashtray screwed to the wall to flick a shred of ash away with a neat forefinger. It was a promenade of trifles that reassured the innocent and distracted the guilty. Outside, the night crouched over fields and river. Inside, the lamps laid their calm over velvet and wood. At the service compartment, where he had found the blanket and vial, he did not open the door, but he stopped and listened. The rails spoke, the hinges creaked faintly as the train shifted, and something else, barely there, a breath, the whisper of a weight trying not to be a weight. He moved on, then doubled back quickly and pushed the door inward. The smell came first, stale wool, damp, and a thread of fear. Below the shelf of folded linens, a bundle stirred and pressed itself tighter against the shadow. Poirot crouched and lifted a corner of blanket. A hand flinched. A face emerged, the bloodless face of Hector Rawlings, eyes blinking in the sudden light, a bruise like a dark coin at his temple, his mouth gagged with a strip torn from something fine. Poirot removed the gag gently. Rawlings drank the air with a sound not unlike greed. "For God's sake," he whispered hoarsely, "I thought you'd never—" "Shh!" Poirot's finger touched his lips lightly. "You will speak softly, monsieur, and only what is necessary. You have not been here by choice." "Locked in," Rawlings croaked. "Caught from behind, dragged, threatened. If I moved, I was told the police would find other things in my baggage." "The police will find nothing you did not pack," Poirot said. "Who did this?" Rawlings shut his eyes, as if the memory hurt as much as the bruise. "A woman's hand, gloved. The man with her, I did not see his face, but he smelled of a strong cologne, and there was something medicinal, like a dentist's room." He swallowed. "Listen to me. I did not kill Vale. I came to take something back." "What thing?" "Papers, Rawlings said, the word almost a spit. Bearer bonds. Numbers copied. Leads to accounts. He was going to sell me to my enemies. I meant to pay to get them back in Belgrade. He pushed for more, asked for half now. Then came the letter. He looked as if he'd seen the bottom of a well. Rawlings's mouth twisted. I told him he was a fool to bring them on the train. They were in his case, Poirot said. An empty folder tells me so. They are no longer there. They're here, then, Rawlings whispered fiercely. Somewhere between this damned salon and the dining car. Whoever took them drugged me and stuffed me where I'd be found too late or not at all. I was meant to be the ghost at Nice, vanish like smoke, and let the story tell itself. Poirot studied him. The torn scrap of camel hair in the washroom hinge, the unlatched vestibule window, the solitary boot print on the rear steps. You stood at a window between the cars? Rawlings' jaw worked. I thought to throw the vial. Someone pressed it into my hand, told me to keep it, in case I needed courage. I realized then what kind of courage it was. I went to pitch it. Someone came up behind me. After that, he touched his temple. Blank. Poirot nodded once. You will remain here, monsieur. I will send the chef de train with water and a promise. No one else. He drew the door almost closed and went straight to the little pantry across the corridor, where he found the chef de train rinsing cups with the abstraction of a man translating anxiety into cleanliness. Poirot spoke low, and the man's face changed from worry to constrained, useful purpose. Bien, Monsieur Poirot, he whispered. It shall be as you say. Returning to the salon, Poirot found new arrangements had made themselves. Mrs. Markham had returned and sat close by the radiator, her hands held to its mild heat, the teacup untouched beside her. Madame Lefebvre had emerged too, an elegant book open on her lap, which she was not reading. Colonel Fanshawe had the air of one who guards a bridge. Dr. Hirsch entered a heartbeat later with a smoothness that suggested he had timed his entrance, not so soon as to seem eager, not so late as to be remarked upon. Poirot's eyes settled on the doctor. You have a cologne, Dr. Hirsch. It is distinctive. Hirsch smiled. I am told it is Viennese, a gift from a grateful patient. And you carry, of course, the medicinal odors of your profession. An occupational hazard, Hirsch said lightly. Poirot did not answer him. Instead, he went to the writing table and lifted the carafe. He took up the 2 notes, turned them slowly so the light caught the strokes, and laid them side by side. A hand that writes to menace, he said conversationally, and a hand that writes to mislead. The slant is to the right, the pressure decisive. The writer is not afraid to be seen, and yet, when one copies the forms of a language not one's own, there are betrayals. The English letter R, for example. The French hand makes it with a little wave. The German hand tightens it like a knot. The second note, his nail touched it, does not quite master. The English R when it writes Rawlings. It fights itself. Interesting. Madame Lefebvre's page fluttered once in the draft. It interests you that someone cannot write English as an Englishman. It interests me, said Poirot, that one who speaks it very well prefers not to write it at all, unless there is no other way. A woman who writes her notes in her own language does not change to another, unless she must be certain her words will be understood by a particular reader, or unless she wishes to disguise herself among his acquaintances. Hirsch's smile thinned a fraction. This is a great deal to draw from a letter and a half, Monsieur Poirot. One draws what the hand gives, Poirot said mildly, but one also draws what the hand touches. He turned to Mrs. Markham. Madam, when you left the dining car before Monsieur Vale, did you pass the ladies' washroom? She startled slightly. I don't recall. Perhaps. And later, did you return there with your book? His eyes moved to the volume in Madame Lefebvre's lap. A book is the most innocent of hiding places. One cuts the pages very finely, along the gutter. One makes a pocket behind the title leaf. A set of numbers, bonds, accounts, slides inside like a pressed flower. There was a tiny silence, like the small intake of breath when a note is struck perfectly on a glass. Madame Lefebvre did not look down at the book. She looked instead at Poirot, with the coolness of a woman who has been appraised and found not equal, but dangerous. "Whose book, monsieur?" "Yours," he said pleasantly, "because you are the only one among us who could walk in and out of compartments with a volume in your hand and draw no comment. Governesses are watched for propriety, journalists for curiosity, colonels for command, doctors for opportunity. But a woman of means, accustomed to hotel suites and train salons, she is invisible when she chooses to be visible only as herself." Madame Lefebvre's smile was exquisitely faint. "You flatter me." "I do not," Poirot returned. "I describe your advantage, and you are very clever. You would never keep such a thing on your person now. You would pass it to someone who could suffer the search and be found with nothing, or to someone who would never be searched at all." Hirsch's gaze had gone still. Bellini, who had slipped in quietly and now lingered by the door, said in a voice carefully cleansed of accent, "Who would never be searched?" "Staff," Poirot said, without looking away from Madame Lefebvre. "But staff have fewer places to hide. Number better a traveller whose case is already marked for another scrutiny. Better a man all expect to be guilty." He let the words fall like beads. "Better Hector Rawlings." Mrs. Markham made a small sound. "But if he is innocent—" "If," Poirot repeated. "And yet a bundle can be placed inside the lining of his valise while he does not watch. And if he vanishes, so does the evidence, unless it is retrieved before the police open the locks, which is why someone went near the luggage car again after Nish." The chef de train appeared, as if conjured by sense rather than signal. He looked from Poirot to the others and back again. Poirot gave him a small nod. "Our missing gentleman is found," he said, as if speaking of a misplaced umbrella. "Alive, with a bruise, and with a story that is very inconvenient for at least 2 people. He will remain where he is for the moment." Hirsch's composure altered by a degree only a watchmaker would see. The colonel's shoulders lifted a fraction and settled. Madame Lefebvre turned a page of her book, too late, too leisurely, and then shut it, as though finished. The cover was a sober green. Poirot's hand reached out, and with delicate courtesy he extended his fingers. "May I, madame?" She did not give it. She set it down instead upon the little table with the tea things, between the carafe and the notes. "If you wish." Poirot did not open it. He placed his palm lightly upon the cover, as if to quiet a restless animal. "There is a moment in every play," he said softly, "when the audience knows what the actors have known all along. We approach it. But before that, one last little act." He rang for the steward and spoke in a tone almost idle. "Coffee for everyone who wishes it, and for Dr. Hirsch, if he will be so accommodating. Perhaps he will show us how he protects his patients. The vial, doctor, it is empty, alas, but the scent remains. You will tell me if it matches anything in your bag." Hirsch's eyes met his, grey and unfriendly. "I do not carry poisons, Monsieur Poirot." "Mais non," said Poirot, "only antidotes." He inclined his head. "Fetch your bag." The doctor left. Poirot lifted his hand from the book and slid it a finger's breadth toward himself. "When he returns," he said, almost to the carafe, "we will take our little journey to Belgrade together. And there, in a room where the doors can be closed and the police can listen without interrupting, we will speak of letters and of numbers pressed into paper and of a hand that writes with assurance in a language it prefers to speak." He looked up. Madame Lefebvre's gaze did not waver. Mrs. Markham's hands had begun to tremble at last. Bellini studied the window, as if it were a painting whose provenance he doubted. The colonel stood like a man who waits for an order he will both give and obey. The train ran on, the lamps steady, the rails repeating themselves like a mantra. Poirot folded his hands and allowed himself the smallest of smiles. "It is almost time," he said. The door at the far end of the carriage opened, and Dr. Hirsch returned, his medical bag in hand. He set it down on the table beside Poirot, with a deliberation that was almost too neat, as though he were arranging an exhibit rather than offering an inspection. "You will find nothing, Monsieur Poirot," he said, the smoothness in his voice so even that it was almost an effort to hear the faint strain beneath it. Poirot inclined his head in gratitude, but said nothing. He undid the clasps, the little metallic clicks carrying with them the hush of the onlookers. Inside, the doctor's instruments lay as they should. Stethoscope, thermometer, the familiar precision of surgical scissors, the smaller implements neatly wrapped. Beneath these was a leather pouch containing small bottles. He drew them out one by one, holding each to the light, remarking gently on its contents: quinine, camphor, tincture of iodine, until he came to a slender vial, its glass slightly clouded at the base. He held it between thumb and forefinger. "Bitter almond," he murmured. "It is amygdalin," Hirsch said immediately. "A preparation used in certain treatments, in controlled doses, harmless, in excess." He let the sentence taper off, a surgeon leaving the incision open. "In excess, yes," Poirot finished. "And this bottle, doctor, it is not from a Viennese supplier, as most of your medicines are. This label is from Istanbul. Curious, for a man who boarded there and has had no patients in that city." Hirsch's gaze remained steady, but the pause before his reply was a fraction too long. "I purchased it for my own work. I have nothing to do with Vail's death." Poirot replaced the vial without comment, closed the bag, and set it aside. "The question, doctor, is not whether you delivered the poison directly. It is who had access to it." Before Hirsch could reply, the chef de train entered, his eyes bright with the kind of controlled excitement only Poirot seemed able to summon from railway staff. He leaned down to whisper, but Poirot gestured for him to speak aloud. "Monsieur, the compartment of Madame Lefebvre, while she was here, was found unlocked. In her wardrobe, among her things, there was a folded sheet of paper. The porter thought it unusual, as it was pressed between the pages of a book." He handed it to Poirot. The paper, when unfolded, revealed numbers, columns of them, carefully written, each headed with the name of a bank. The handwriting was Vail's, a match to the signatures in his documents. Bearer bonds and account details, stripped of their folders and now bare to the light. Poirot laid it flat on the table beside the notes and the torn scrap of camel hair. "Madame," he said softly, "your book appears to have developed a second story." Her eyes moved over the paper without haste. "If that is what you think it is, then perhaps it was placed there without my knowledge." "Indeed," Poirot said. "It would be a convenient place to hide something in plain sight. In the luggage of a woman above suspicion, to be retrieved later, if the train reached Belgrade without incident." Madame Lefebvre's lips curved faintly. "And you think I was above suspicion?" Poirot's moustache twitched. "Until you cease to be." He tapped the page with one fingertip. "Monsieur Rawlings says he came to recover these papers. Vail intended to use them for leverage, against whom we do not yet say. But whoever removed them from his case needed a way to transport them unseen. A book suffices. A book passed, perhaps, from one hand to another while conversing in the corridor, or when lending a volume for a moment's amusement." His eyes shifted to Dr. Hirsch. "And a doctor may be invited into a lady's compartment to tend to some invented discomfort. A doctor whose bag perhaps contains a vial from Istanbul. A doctor who is trusted enough to leave without the suspicion that he has taken something with him, or left something behind." Hirsch's voice was calm. "If you are accusing me, Monsieur Poirot, do so plainly." Poirot shook his head. "Not yet, for to accuse One must be certain of more than opportunity. One must understand the motive, not the one displayed like a costume, but the one kept in the pocket. The train gave a sudden jolt as it passed over a junction, the vibration running through the table and making the carafe tremble. Poirot steadied it with a hand, his gaze never leaving Hirsch. "You see, Doctor, the second note, the one to me, was written to draw my eyes away from Rawlings. That means its author knew I suspected him. Who here has been privy to every turn of my thought? Who has been present in nearly every gathering, hearing what I hear? Only those who made themselves available at every opportunity, either by profession or by habit." Bellini shifted slightly in his seat, but Poirot did not look at him. His gaze moved instead to Mrs. Markham. "Madame, when you first spoke of Vale, you said you had met him once before in London. You neglected to add that you were at that reception with Dr. Hirsch, and that, afterwards, you travelled together to Vienna. You are not strangers, you and the good doctor." Mrs. Markham's hands froze against the teacup. "We know each other professionally." "Ah," said Poirot, "the profession of secrets. For I think you knew of Vale's possession of these documents. I think you told Hirsch, and I think between you decided that Belgrade was the moment to take them. Only Vale received his letter, and panic breeds unpredictability." His eyes swept the table. "So, Hirsch procured a poison in Istanbul. It was small enough to carry, strong enough to work in minutes. Mrs. Markham, perhaps, distracted Vale. She was seen speaking with him briefly in the corridor, while Hirsch delivered the wine-glass. Then, when Vale was dead, the papers were removed and passed to Madame Lefebvre for temporary safekeeping, with or without her knowledge. Rawlings was locked away to ensure the police would find nothing useful on him, and a note was left for me to keep my attention divided." Madame Lefebvre gave a soft laugh. "And you will prove this, monsieur?" Poirot's head inclined. "It will not be difficult. The paper bears Vale's fingerprints, and at least one other's. The glass, though it has been touched since, will show the trace of a distinctive powder used to disguise the scent of amygdalin, and the porter who cleaned the corridor will recall who passed the book into Madame Lefebvre's hands. One may not yet know whether you, Madame, were conspirator or pawn, but I think the truth will be clear before Belgrade." Dr. Hirsch rose, slow and deliberate, as though the air had grown heavier. "You are clever, Monsieur Poirot, but you gamble. Without proof, you have nothing." Poirot smiled faintly. "Then it is fortunate that proof, like the truth, has a way of arriving on schedule, especially on the Orient Express." The train plunged into a cutting, and the sound deepened, wrapping the salon in a cocoon of steel and snow. Poirot looked at each of them in turn, the arrangement on the table now a complete picture in his mind. "When we arrive," he said quietly, "I will ask you all to join me in the dining car. There, with the police present, I will speak the rest of what I know. And I promise you, mes amis, there will be no more shadows to hide in." The dining car had been prepared as Poirot requested. Lamps turned low so the brass fittings gleamed, curtains drawn against the darkness outside. The gendarmes waited at either end, silent, their presence a steady pressure. The passengers took their places one by one, each finding the seat that seemed least likely to draw the eye, though Poirot's gaze touched them all, as if to say that the arrangement mattered not at all. At the head of the table, he remained standing, his hands lightly on the back of his chair. "Mes amis," he began, "we have travelled together from Istanbul through the snows, and along the way a man has died. It would be easy to say it was Hector Rawlings, the missing passenger, who killed him, that he vanished into the night to avoid justice. But that is a lie placed before us, a tableau arranged so that the truth would remain behind the curtain." He turned his gaze briefly to Rawlings, now seated under guard. "Our absent friend was no innocent, but in this matter he was a target. not the hand. Someone wished to make him the scapegoat, and so he was locked away, drugged, hidden from view, conveniently absent when suspicion was needed, conveniently present when the police might search. His hand hovered over the table, above the row of small, damning objects. First, the note to Vale. You have until Belgrade. It is a threat, written by a hand confident enough to deliver it in public. Then, the poison, a preparation of amygdalin, purchased in Istanbul, strong enough to work in minutes and disguised in wine. The second note, to me, is the most telling. It was meant to draw my eyes away from Rawlings, to force me to spend my time chasing a false lead. This note contains the same telltale R as the first, a Germanic form, inconsistent with an English education. Who among us speaks perfect English but does not write it so? Dr. Hirsch. A ripple went through the table. Hirsch's face did not move. Yes, doctor. You procured the poison, but you did not act alone. Mrs. Markham, you knew Vale before this journey. You knew what he carried in his case, the account numbers, the bearer bonds. You told the doctor, and together you planned to take them before he could sell them to Rawlings's enemies. You distracted him in the corridor, giving Hirsch the moment to slip the wineglass onto his table in the dining car. After his death, you retrieved the papers and passed them into Madame Lefebvre's keeping. Why her? Because her luggage would never be searched until Belgrade, and because in a book on her table the folded sheet could be hidden without question. Madame Lefebvre's voice was cool. If this is true, I was used. Perhaps, madame, but you were not used unwisely. Poirot inclined his head to her. Still, when the gendarmes compare the porter's recollection with the prints on that page, we will know exactly who handled it last. The chain is not so hard to follow. Mrs. Markham's voice came thin, brittle. You cannot prove I knew what was in that book. Poirot's eyes softened in a way that was not mercy, but inevitability. Ah, madam, but you will prove it for me. When a woman tries to hide her fear, she does not look at the object she fears. Yet since you entered this carriage tonight, you have not once looked away from that paper. He let the silence stretch. Markham's fingers trembled on the table, then fell still. Beside her, Hirsch sat with his hands folded, but the stiffness in his shoulders betrayed the end of defiance. Poirot straightened, his voice carrying the finality of a closing case. It was about money, yes, but more than that, it was about ensuring that Vale could not bargain his way free of those who hunted him. You decided to remove him, to take what he carried, and to make another man pay for it. But murder, mes amis, is a clumsy tool in the hands of the clever. It leaves marks, not only on the body, but on the mind, in the hurried letter, the misplaced scrap of cloth, the vial forgotten in the dark. He stepped back from the table. The police will take you now. The train will continue to Belgrade, but for you, the journey ends here. As the gendarmes moved forward, Madame Lefebvre closed her book with the soft finality of someone turning the last page of a story. Rawlings exhaled, his relief tinged with bitterness. The others sat in a stunned stillness, broken only by the steady rhythm of the rails. Poirot, taking his seat at last, reached for the coffee the steward had poured. He stirred it once, precisely, and smiled faintly to himself. "It is curious," he murmured, "how on a train one may travel hundreds of miles, yet still end up exactly where one's nature has always been taking them." And outside, in the darkness, the Orient Express carried on, the snow swallowing the sound of its passing.